Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today. We are going to just give it a couple more minutes. We've got some more people jumping on. So we'll probably get started in just a couple of minutes. So just hold tight. All right. Good afternoon again, everyone. We are going to get started. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. My name is Jennifer Doyle, and I'm a co founder and the Vice President of Customer Success and Support here at InspectPoint. I will be moderating today's presentation, and I am joined today by Jason Webb, who is the Director of Industry Affairs at Potter Electric Signal. He has a lot of really great information to share with us. But before I turn it over to him, just want to do some light housekeeping. We, at the end of this presentation, should have about 15 minutes or so for questions. And those will be live questions. So if you have anything that you want to ask in regards to this topic, just drop those questions into the question area. You'll see a little question icon on your GoToWebinar control panel if you're on your computer. So you can just drop those in there and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can live on today's call. Any of those questions that we do not get to address live, they will be addressed. So those questions with your information will be sent over to Jason and he will follow up in an email with you. So without further ado, like I said, we've got lots of great information. I know your time's important, so we just want to get started with it. I'm going to kick it over to Jason. So Jason, it's you now.
Okay. Yeah, great. Thanks, Jennifer, and
Yep.
thanks everybody for joining us. This is a topic that is, NFPA 25 always seems to be of interest to folks, and whenever any kind of a little hiccup in the economy occurs, inspections always become that much more important, to maintain systems and the business side that comes along with that, the important operational readiness piece that comes along. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but the purpose of this webinar was to kind of touch on like the title says, the top 10 sort of non-technical things. The book, of course, is full of technical requirements, the rules that are necessary to maintain, test, and inspect the sprinkler system, the fire pump system, what have you. But there's a lot of, as everybody knows that deals with NFPA 25, there's always a lot of questions that kind of revolve around not the easy stuff, you gotta, like your owner's manual says, change the oil every 3,000 miles, but some of these non-technical requirements. So that's kind of what this is about. We'll just kind of go through them in a question and answer format, and hopefully you'll get something out of it. So we'll just start with the number one here. Well, maybe we will as soon as I get my computer to answer my clicks. So we kind of start from the beginning. Why do the fire codes require compliance with NFPA 25? Why do we have to do all this in the first place? And that answer really revolves around kind of what I just mentioned there, that operational readiness of the system. Is the system, can we have a comfort factor in the fact that the system is ready to operate? And we know that generally the answer to that question is yes, of course. Sprinkler systems are very reliable inherently. They've been around, certainly proven technology. There's nothing that provides us better protection against unwanted fire than a sprinkler system. But we also know that there are some issues that generally we know about. We'll talk about some of those specifics here in a minute. But the reason that the codes drive us to perform inspection, testing, and maintenance are to keep these numbers high. The numbers you see on the screen here are from Dr. Hall's study at NFPA. I think these are from the 2014 edition of the Sprinkler Experience in the US, but the same data has been around for many years on the overall quote unquote success rate of sprinkler systems. What Dr. Hall at NFPA considered success was, did the sprinkler system operate and did it do, whatever it was designed to do? Did it control the fire? Did it keep it in the room of origin? Whatever the purpose of that system was. And as you can see, these numbers are generally very high, and that's what we've come to expect out of sprinkler systems. But there's always room to improve, right? I mean, you see some of these numbers in the low 90s. We certainly want to improve those to get as close to 100% as possible. And then you see things like storage occupancies that are kind of an outlier here on success rate. And there's a lot of factors that go into that. We'll talk about some of those as we go through here. But anytime we can, or anything we can do to improve these numbers is important. These are, after all, life safety systems. So the goal is to drive that number as close to 100% as possible. And that's why the codes require the mandate that these systems be maintained in accordance with NFPA 25. The things that and we've all seen these. These are a couple of these pictures I just grabbed off of social media sites from that some of you are undoubtedly on and pay attention to. But some of these issues happen suddenly, right? You see the bent stem on the OSY that could happen instantly with a forklift or a car, versus some things like corrosion that take a period of time. But we know that these are the kinds of things that drive that sprinkler system success rate down, and that's why the codes say it's important for us to be on the lookout for these kinds of problems. So where does the technical committee, the NFPA 25 technical committee, come up with the ITM requirements, the rules that are in the book? Well, actually, a lot of the requirements, or the vast majority of them, come directly from that same study that we talked about a while ago with Dr. Hall. The goal is to make data-driven decisions in NFPA 25. It's not always possible because we don't always have hard numbers. Those numbers are getting better. There's a lot more data available today than there was in the past, but we're still woefully short of being able to make those hard data-driven decisions. But generally, that's where the technical committee comes up with it, as we look at sprinkler system failures, and then what could we do to address those. So if you look into Dr. Hall's study, that Sprinkler Experience in the US report from NFPA, and again, these reports come out, I think, annually still. So these numbers change over time, but they're generally the same, category or same ratios. And if you look at these failure rates, the way Dr. Hall broke these down in this particular study was in two different categories: when the system fails to operate at all, and then we'll look here in a minute at when the system operates but it's ineffective. But when the system fails to operate at all, the numbers are right there in front of you. Well, the ones you can read. The slide's a little hard to see sometimes, but about 2/3 of the time when the system fails to operate, it's because the valve was shut, right? And the rest of the times we generally know the categories of failures. manual intervention. Somebody did something to defeat the system. Damaged components, lack of maintenance, things like that. The question you ask yourself, are these preventable? Are they things that we can identify during an inspection or test and correct? And the answer is almost always yes, right? If we can we identify a shut valve? Of course we can. Is that a big burden on the owner to do? And the answer is no. It doesn't cost a lot of money to have a valve looked at every so often to make sure it's still open. So those are some of the decisions that go into what rules end up in NFPA 25. Likewise, as I mentioned, the other side of this failure coin is when, one, when the system failed to operate at all, but two, when the system operated, but for whatever reason was ineffective. And it's the same, you'll see these same categories appear year after year, generally. About half the time when the system operated, but the system failed to do whatever it was supposed to do, is because water couldn't reach the fire. So if you combine some of these and start putting two and two together, you'll see where these requirements come from. So if you take that failure rate data from the earlier slide in, say, a storage occupancy, you know that failures of systems and storage occupancies occur at a higher rate than they do others. And then you combine it, you combine it with these failure numbers of why, and water doesn't reach the fire. So what would cause water not to reach the fire in a storage occupancy, for example? So we know that we can put those together and identify and create rules around how can we ensure that water can reach a fire in a storage occupancy. That's through verifying that there's not storage too close to sprinklers and so on. So anyway, that's where generally where the rules come from, and again, it gets better as we go along, but that's where basically the concepts behind the rules that are in NFPA 25 come from. So if we've identified the rules, next kind of comes frequencies. How does the committee identify or establish how often we should perform those tasks? This is a little harder sometimes, right? Establishing the rules comes from that data, but how often maybe we should do it is a little bit more difficult to establish. And then there's several factors that go into this conversation. First, let's talk about the definition of frequency. So in the 2014 edition, NFPA 25 first defined the term frequency. And what frequency means in NFPA 25 is the minimum and maximum time between events. It's not a qualifying term, meaning there's no such thing as a quote annual inspection or a quarterly inspection. What the term frequency means is the time that elapses between events. So an annual inspection, for example, occurs now within this window out of this definition that's in NFPA 25. There are what we call frequency windows. So an annual inspection, for example, is an inspection that occurs once a year, once per calendar year, with a minimum of 9 months and a maximum of 15 months between them. So that inspection doesn't have to happen if it happened on May 15th of this year. It doesn't have to happen exactly on May 15th of next year to be in compliance, right? There's that window that allows that frequency to still be in compliance with the standard. The other piece that goes along with so we've identified what the issues are that we want to look for in an inspection or a test, and then we're starting to apply this frequency, and we use the definition out of 25. The other piece that applies in this conversation is this balance of trying to find that sweet spot between how long a problem might go undetected versus testing or inspecting so often that you cause a problem, right? So think about this in terms of a fire pump. Can we want to reduce the amount of time that a fire pump could potentially sit there and not be working, but we also don't want to test it so often that we wear it out. So could we test a fire pump every day? And the answer is, of course, yes. But that would, although it would reduce the amount of time it could go undetected, a problem could go undetected, we would also wear out the fire pump that much sooner. So there's got to be a balance there. And really, there's really very little science that goes into this at this point. The data that's growing, the numbers that are out there are helping, and we're seeing models now where we can identify lifespans and things like that. But all those things go into, all those factors go into the conversation about establishing frequency. So we've identified the issues and how often we should do inspection, testing, and maintenance. Really, the next question is who's responsible for performing it, for having the inspection, testing, and maintenance done and complying with NFPA 25. Well, this is one of the cases where the standard's actually very clear. NFPA 25 in section 4.1, which is aptly titled Responsibility of the Property Owner or Designated Representative, makes it clear that the owner or their designated representative is the one that's responsible for inspecting, testing, and maintaining their system. Now, the owner can certainly delegate that authority to an occupant or a property manager, a leasee, or a tenant, things like that. But there's some annex material that kind of addresses some of these. You would expect to see that clarified in an agreement somehow. But ultimately, it's the owner, and that's what we always say about NFPA 25. This is an owner's document. It's the owner's manual for the sprinkler system. So if the owner is responsible for inspecting, testing, and maintaining, well, who can perform the actual work? Who can do the actual inspection, tests, and maintenance? And there's always that discussion about, can the owner perform their own inspection, testing, and maintenance? And really, that answer is, if from the perspective of the standard alone, the answer is yes. The standard kind of expects, if you will, that the owner is going to be performing many of these tasks themselves. But regardless of who does the work, whether it's the owner or a contractor that they hire or a maintenance person that they employ, whoever does that work has to be qualified, must be performed by qualified personnel. That's what the standard says. So that's the fire code, references the standard. We'll talk about that in a minute. But that kind of establishes the minimum requirements for who can perform this work based on the code of the standard itself. The term qualified that is defined in Chapter 3, and it includes a couple of basic qualifications. Number one, that person that does it has to be competent and capable. And two, they have to meet the requirements of the authority having jurisdiction. So because NFPA 25 is, I kind of say, purposely vague, if you will, NFPA 25 doesn't try to get in the weeds too much with who can do what. It just says whoever's doing the work must be qualified. That conversation often drives people to ask about licensing and things like that. You got to remember that qualified does not equal licensing in the eyes of the code, in the eyes of the standard. What the standard says is competent and capable, meeting the requirements of the AHJ. So often the AHJ uses licensing to establish the qualifications. They'll establish a test or whatever to that helps them establish who's qualified to perform the work. So licensing and qualified are not always synonymous. They may be in some states, depending on how the laws are written, but some jurisdictions may say anybody that performs this work has to have a license. Others say that if the owner is doing it, they don't have to be licensed, but if they hire somebody, they do. And then there's still other states that don't require anything at all. There's several states actually that don't require any kind of licensing at all. So that that the level of qualification falls almost directly back to the local AHJ in many cases, and they have to decide if that person's qualified or not. So that can really make it hard on an AHJ trying to enforce the standard sometimes. The other consideration that has to take place here is that as the tasks themselves become more complicated, well, obviously the qualification level goes up as well. So is it the same level of qualifications that someone needs to look at a gauge, for example, versus performing a annual fire pump test? That level of qualification is certainly different. So all these things come into play, and that's kind of why NFPA 25, in most people's opinion, tends to just leave it at that blanket statement that you have to be qualified to do whatever it is you're doing, whether it's looking at a gauge or performing a standpipe test off of a roof outlet. Whoever's doing that work has to be qualified, and then they leave it up to the jurisdiction to decide what that specific level of qualification is. Number 6, which edition of NFPA 25 applies where I'm located? This one also can be a little confusing sometimes. The thing to always remember is that NFPA 25 applies to really every system that's out there, every existing system. I always say there's a lot more existing systems out there than there are new ones. We spend a lot of time focusing on new systems, commissioning and things, and that's critical. We have to get them right to start with, but there's a lot more existing systems than there are new ones. So as changes take place in NFPA 25, we have to remember all these changes apply to every system that's out there. So knowing which edition applies where you're performing work or whether you're, where the building is located is critical. Typically, the way this works is through the codes that are adopted. NFPA 25 is a standard, of course, a standard for inspection, testing, and maintenance of water-based systems. So the codes establish the when and where. Standards typically establish the how. That's the simplest way to remember it. So the fire code, whichever fire code is adopted, establishes the when and where. It says when you have a sprinkler system, it has to be maintained in accordance with NFPA 25. So the standard establishes that all the detailed rules for how to perform those inspections and tests. Those standards, by reference in the codes, are referenced specifically. So the 2018 IFC that here on the slide, for example, references the 2017 edition of NFPA 25. That's typically what happens. The codes adopt the most recent edition that was out when that code was written. So typically that's how it works. Not always, but that's typically how we understand which edition applies where we're at. It's really which edition does the fire code, the building code reference. But that's not always the case. Sometimes states can adopt their own NFPA 25. California, for example, produces its own version. It's the California edition of NFPA 25. So kind of regardless of what their fire code may change what cycles you may be in the fire code in some states. The NFPA 25 may be a freestanding document. Some jurisdictions adopt NFPA 25 separately. The state of Florida, for example, adopts NFPA 25 not only as a reference in the fire code, but they also adopt it as a kind of a freestanding document. It's a freestanding adoption. So that may change mid-cycle. So it's not always tied to the fire code, but it's often tied to the fire code. So what records are required to be kept? What does NFPA 25 tell us? Well, it's all contained in Chapter 4. 4.3 requires records be kept or made and kept for all inspection, testing, and maintenance. Anything that's done, so whether it's recording the temperature, the pressure on a gauge on a daily basis in some cases, or the temperature in a fire pump enclosure, for example, a fire pump room in the wintertime, that's a daily inspection. So that record has to be kept every day. all the way up to 5, 10, 20-year inspections or testing of sprinklers and things like that. Any inspection, test, and maintenance it's not done until there's a record of it. So 4.3 establishes all that. The records themselves out of NFPA 25, the record requirements are fairly basic. I think there's 5 bullet points that you have to comply with. It's essentially who did it, what was done, and the date, right? There's not a lot of detail that's required by NFPA 25, but there's also some requirements to maintain those records for 1 year beyond the next inspection and test of that type. So it could be pretty extensive pile of records, right, that are required for a system over time. And it's important to point out that electronic records are permitted. So while the specific rules are fairly basic, the use of electronic records is becoming very common, of course, and that provides us with a lot deeper dive into the condition of the system, a long-term view of maybe what's going on with the system. So the electronic records are certainly permitted by the code, and people are certainly headed down that path a lot more today than maybe in the past. Number 8, what's the difference between an internal assessment and an obstruction investigation? So this is a question that comes up often when I'm teaching NFPA 25. There is a big difference between the 2 tasks, and we're kind of bordering on technical here, but this is one that definitely comes up often. I want to make sure we address it in my top 10 here. Internal inspections, let's call it an internal inspection to start with. We'll explain what changed here in a minute, but an internal inspection and obstruction investigations kind of used to all be lumped together in Chapter 14 of NFPA 25. In the 2011 edition, these 2 tasks were split into 2 sections of Chapter 14. Internal inspections, looking inside the pipe, is a frequency-based task. It has to occur every 5 years, period. It occurs every 5 years, regardless. Obstruction investigations are a little different. They're a function of, they're kind of the next step. If you discover something, for example, during an internal inspection or any of the other, I think there are 14 triggers or 15 now, things that trigger an obstruction investigation. But those are not routine tasks. A system can go its entire life and never have to have an obstruction investigation, but it has to have an internal inspection or internal assessment every 5 years. So the internal inspection or assessment now, we'll talk about in a minute, but that task is a 5-year frequency event. The obstruction investigation is triggered by certain events, and those are all listed in Chapter 14, and we don't have time to get into those specifically, but each of those are listed in Chapter 14. So I told you that the internal inspection has changed. So that what happened in the 2014 edition was that the task of opening up the pipe changed. It's renamed now assessment of internal condition, as opposed to being an internal inspection. In other words, a hard prescriptive requirement to open up the pipe and look inside it every 5 years. That changed. Now what's required is an assessment of the internal condition. And the concept or the thought behind it is still the same, but the prescriptive requirements to remove a sprinkler from the end of a branch line and open up a flushing connection at the end of one main, that was the prescriptive requirements that were required in the past. Those have moved to the annex. And now the rule is an internal or assessment of internal condition, and then it kind of leaves it up to the technician with the AHJ's input and the owner to figure out what's the best way to assess the internal condition. And if you go to the annex for section 14.2, all those options for complying with this section are now listed in the annex. So there's a lot of different ways to comply with this assessment of internal condition. None of these really changed in the 2017 or even the 2020 edition. So it's been the same since the 2014. No longer an internal inspection, but it's an assessment of internal condition, and there's many other ways to comply. So if we're doing these internal assessments, what are we looking for? What does an internal assessment or internal inspection tell us? Well, the purpose directly out of Chapter 14 is to identify foreign, organic, or inorganic material. That's a mouthful there, but that's the intent, is just that, to look for things inside the pipe that shouldn't be there, whether that's corrosion or a 2x4 or a glove, left over from installation. That's what we're looking inside the pipe. We're assessing the internal condition of the pipe. Remember, I said that all the guidance for how to comply with this section are now in the annex. One of the things that you can do to comply with NFPA 25 Chapter 14 is as simple as a water sample and test that for certain things. And the key to this is, in my opinion, is that it's never too late to take action. Whenever you discover whatever that problem is, and often that problem is related to corrosion. We know corrosion is a significant problem. If you ask 10 owners what's the biggest problem with their sprinkler system, 9 of them are going to tell you it's corrosion. It's never too late to do something about corrosion. There's always a solution to solve the corrosion problem. So that's important to keep in mind. But the purpose, but the real key here is to make sure we're assessing that internal condition at least every 5 years. That's a key to the health of the sprinkler system. Well, we finally got there, number 10 out of our top 10 list of non-technical requirements. How do I change NFPA 25? Everybody has their own opinions, and sometimes multiple opinions about NFPA 25, what should and shouldn't be there, the scope of the document, how it should apply to certain things or it shouldn't apply to certain things. It should address recalls, it shouldn't address recalls. I mean, there's a lot of debate about NFPA 25 and its scope and the rules that are contained in it. And what I always recommend is submit proposals. If you have a better way of doing it, the committee, I think wants to hear about that. And the way to go about that is very simple. It's a very simple process that's spelled out on NFPA's website. Just like any other NFPA document, you go to nfpa.org/25 or whatever the standard is you're looking for. And if you go to nfpa.org/25, you'll see a screen that looks just like this on your screen. And within that document page is everything you need to know to submit your proposal to make this standard better, or to address whatever issue you think it should address or not address. That swirly graphic there on the right is the process that NFPA publishes on the standard development process. NFPA 25, at the time we're recording this, we're presenting this webinar today, is actually open to public input, meaning that it's the very beginning of the, believe it or not, 2023 edition of NFPA 25. It's open for public input. So if you have an idea for a change and you're listening to this live today, now's your chance. Submit that public input now. I think public inputs are due first week of June or somewhere around there. So you've got a few weeks, or a couple of weeks now, to submit ideas for improving the standard, and it'll begin that long process. And it's all spelled out there in that graphic. We won't go through it all, but all this information is available on those standard pages, nfpa.org/25. And I would strongly encourage you to become involved. Anybody can submit a proposal. Every proposal has to be heard and dealt with by the technical committee. So get involved, and if you've got a better way, everybody's looking for that. So those are my top 10. I know everybody has their own ideas of what a top 10 list should be, but those are kind of my top 10, I think, we could spend all day on the technical requirements of each chapter if we wanted to, but from a non-technical perspective, there's a lot of things that we need to make sure we get right about responsibilities and qualifications and things like that as well. And I think that's critical to complying with this standard. So I hope you got something out of it. And I think Jennifer's been collecting a few questions out there that we can address here in our remaining few minutes together. But
Yes, yes.
my email is here on the screen. I just lastly wanted to say, feel free to shoot me an email anytime. Don't hesitate to reach out.
All right, perfect. And then one other thing too, we wanted to just mention as well is feel free to email either Jason or myself, not only any questions, but also if you need a certificate of attendance for today, we'll be happy to provide those. Just email either one of us, and we can get that over to you. All right, perfect. So we do have some questions that have come in. So I'm just going to kind of jump into the questions that have come in from some of the attendees today. One of the questions that we have is, do any insurance companies require NICET in inspections for their properties?
In, I'm not aware of any specific requirements. Typically, the insurance folks, in my experience, uh, rely on the local, the rules that are in place where the building is. But I'm not aware of any off the top of my head, but that's certainly a good question for the owner, if you're a contractor, for your customer to verify.
Okay. All right, perfect. Um, We have a question about an internal inspection and an obstruction inspection. Aren't they basically the same thing? How would you could you kind of expand on that a little bit
Right.
different or a little bit more, I should say.
Sure. Yeah. So the internal assessment is really just that. It's a snapshot in time. What does the inside of what's the condition of the inside of the pipe? The obstruction investigation goes into a lot more detail, and it gives you a lot more prescriptive requirements. I think there's 4 places that you have to open the pipe up to conduct a obstruction investigation, including the riser and other places that are way above and beyond what the internal assessment requires. So the internal assessment, like I said, even today, under today's rules, you can do as, I won't say as little, but as you can comply with the internal assessment requirements by simply taking a water sample. But the once an obstruction investigation is triggered by one of those 14 triggers that are in chapter 14, then there's a lot more that takes place. You have to establish a flushing plan if you find things. I mean, it goes into very much more detail. So it is just a lot more in depth and a lot more in detail. And they are 2 completely different things.
Okay, perfect. All right. We have another question that is the owner required to correct problems found during the inspection?
Yes, that
Yes.
question comes up often, and as a contractor, a service provider, of course, it's not really our our role to enforce the code, but the NFPA 25, as well as the fire code for that matter. But yes, NFPA 25 in chapter 4 says the owner shall correct or repair deficiencies that are found. So there is a specific requirement that anything that's discovered has to be corrected. Now, again, it's up to the authority having jurisdiction, whoever that may be, to enforce that. But yes, to comply with NFPA 25, the answer is yes.
Okay, perfect. We have another question in regards to, is there a way to view what others are proposing for changes to any of the codes?
Not until the first draft, those public inputs are published. So not really. Under the way the system works on the NFPA's website, it's all online now. You can view your public inputs, but you can't view others' public inputs until those public inputs are published.
Okay, perfect. And we've got a lot of questions here, so I'm just gonna you're gonna be getting, Jason, just a heads up, an email with a lot of questions. They're good ones here, but
That's great.
um,
No, no problem. I promise, as we said earlier, for those of you that are listening, I will respond to all of them. I promise.
so I think we've got time for like one or two more. So I've got this one's a good one. Are any NFPA 25 standard requirements retroactive? I have a 1960 high rise with no AFSS where the four standpipes do not describe the location on the building that the standpipes serve.
Yeah. So the retroactive is kind of oh, it's hard to define that term when it comes to NFPA 25 because by definition, NFPA 25 is a retroactive standard. In other words, every system that is in the jurisdiction has to comply with NFPA 25. So in reality, the answer is yes. But remember that also that NFPA 25 doesn't require any kind of design evaluation. So if there's if components aren't there, you can't inspect or test them, right? I hope that answers the question. But yes, in a better example, maybe a better way to put it is so like when the fire pump churn test frequencies changed from weekly to monthly with electric fire pumps, right? That applies to all the fire pumps in that jurisdiction as soon as that new addition is adopted. So, so yeah, by definition, NFPA 25 is a retroactive standard just because of the way it's written, but it doesn't apply to design issues. It's only inspection, testing, and maintenance.
Okay, perfect. And then I've got one question in regards to California. So can individuals who possess the California State Fire Marshal weekly fire pump test certificate, whew, that's a mouthful, perform annual testing?
So I don't profess to be an expert in California
Oh,
licensing. I know that there is what's called an L license for limited, and that can has certain rules that apply to L licenses and others. But if you'll send me that question in writing, I
yeah.
will make sure that I'll connect them with someone who can answer that question.
All right, perfect. Perfect. All right, well, we're at the 45-minute mark, and like I said, I've got a lot of really good questions here. So what I'll do is I will compile all these questions and get them over to Jason. Um, if you think of any other questions, Jason is very graciously will answer any and all questions that are sent his way. So I just want to thank everybody for being here today. Jason, thank you so much for presenting this to everybody. This was really great information, and thank you for offering up to answer any additional questions after the fact as well. Um, so yeah, so with that being said, anybody who did register, you will get a recording of this as well. So if you want to, review this after the fact, keep your eyes peeled. There'll be a recording of this coming around very shortly. But with that, once again, I just want to say thank you and send any and all questions either to Jason or myself, and we'll get those answered for you. So thank you again.
Thank you.